Well, hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome to a conversation with Nick Petrie, sponsored by the Milwaukee Public Library and Boswell Books. My name is Dan Kentowski, and I'm a librarian for the Milwaukee Public Library. And I'm honored to have best-selling author and local Milwaukeean Nick Petrie with us tonight. He is the author, hi Nick. He is the author of 6 previous Peter Ash novels, and his latest in the series, The Runaway, was recently published by G.P. Putnam's and Sons. So after this program, if you haven't already, I'd like you to encourage to grab a copy of The Runaway from Boswell Books. Thank you for joining us again. After our conversation with Nick, we're going to leave time for you to ask questions to Nick, personal questions, anything you want to know about his book, his writing. We're going to leave time for that. So if you could wait to ask questions or ask questions toward the end, but if you have something, write it down in the chat and we can look at it and maybe we could adjust it right away. So don't hesitate to ask your questions.
Yeah, don't wait. If something comes up, just throw it in the chat and we'll try to get to it.
Fantastic. So without further ado, Nick, why don't you tell us about your new book, The Runaway?
Will do. And thanks, Dan, for having me. And thanks to the Milwaukee Public Library for having me. I'm a big library fan, as I'm sure you know. So The Runaway starts with a young woman named Helene. She's 18 years old. She's the night clerk at a gas station on the far west side, the far west edge of the Great Plains in eastern Montana. And it's a tiny little town. It's almost not a town at all. There's only 2 people in it. There's Helene and her boss, a guy named Bogalusa, who is also her landlord, and he's also a deputy sheriff. And that position of power allows him to essentially decide to take liberties with Helene, and he is enjoying sort of threatening her and leading up to what he's going to do. And so she's feeling increasingly desperate about her situation. And a stranger shows up at her gas station in the middle of the night, and he's kind to her, which is not something that happens a lot to Helene. And she realizes that maybe this is the only opportunity she's going to have to sort of change her life, change her luck. So she follows him out to the gas pumps and says, "Hey, mister, take me with you." And he says, "Well, where do you want to go?" And her answer is, "Anywhere but here." And so she gets in his truck and she thinks she's going off to a new life. But of course, her life, things get worse from there, because this is a thriller, and that's what we do to the characters we like, is we put them in trouble and make their lives hard. So that's the start of the book, anyway. And the what happens after that is Peter Ash, our hero, runs into Helene, and when she's on the run from her husband, and he does his best to help her out. And of course, that doesn't go so well either, because that's my job.
Fantastic. And there's a feeling of tension after reading the book. There is a feeling of tension. So it starts out great and it gets better from there. Peter Ash is kind of like a flawed character, which I like, but do you think flawed characters make them more interesting to the reader? Or is it like a necessary element in the story to create conflict?
Well, I'm a fan of not necessarily flawed characters, but complex characters, and I like when I, as a reader, I like characters that feel like real people, like people that you would know, people that you could have a conversation with. And I'm not a perfect person by any stretch, and so my goal is just to describe somebody, to give you a character to root for. And if they're all perfect and they're all good, it's less interesting to root for them in my mind.
Completely agree.
And Peter is not entirely a good guy. He's an adrenaline junkie. He makes some questionable choices. And to me, that's part of what makes him interesting.
Yeah, and I think what I meant by flawed is, the PTSD, and he tends to do what he wants to do instead of what you're supposed to do. And it's not really a flaw in some ways, but it's it's a flaw in being that you don't follow the rules. And I like that because it does create a sense of conflict. And I think it does make Peter very much more interesting to the reader, because you wonder, is he going to do what he's supposed to do, or is he going to do something? Is he going to hang a quick left turn?
Well, if we all did what we were supposed to do, I mean, that, in the real world, right? We all are, there are rules that we try to live by. We try to be good people, blah, blah, blah. But in a story that's supposed to be thrilling, it's not so interesting if everybody does exactly what they should do. The book would be much shorter if Peter simply said, well, gosh, let me call the police and they can take it from here.
Right. Do you think characters like Peter, Lewis, and June have traits that make them distinctly Milwaukeean?
That's a good question. I think of them as Midwesterners more than I think of them as Milwaukeean, although Peter is a Midwesterner, Lewis is a Midwesterner, and June's actually from California. But I do think that there is a certain kind of sort of hard work, fair play, do the right thing that to me is something that is distinctly Midwestern. And it seems kind of out of vogue in certain corners. The whole idea that you tell the truth, even if it hurts you, that you do the right thing, even if it's not to your advantage. And I think, that's the person that I try to be. Again, I'm sure I'm not as successful as I'd like, but I think those Midwestern qualities are valuable and important.
And it is kind of, in this genre of writing, they're usually like the thriller genre. There's another writer that I read a lot whose characters are up in Duluth in Minnesota. And I find that interesting because they're not from London and they're not from Los Angeles.
Is this Kent Kruger you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. Kent is a lovely guy and he's a great writer.
I also like Brian Freeman's books from up in that northern. I think he's a Duluth writer too. And I like that because it's not so cosmopolitan-y, and they tie in. I think the Midwest has like some kind of folky element that some people might not be. If you're from down south, you might feel like a Cajun's folky, where we have our own little northern kind of folky thing too. And I find that it adds something unique to those kind of books. And I think yours falls right into that same kind of genre.
Well, thank you. I'm kind of with you in that, every writer wants his book to be, to sort of be distinctive, right? And you could write a kind of wise guy New York or New Jersey book. There are Southern writers whose work I love that have a certain flavor. They're, LA writers, Boston, every place kind of has their characters. And the Midwest, I think we pick a larger neighborhood. We think of this as the upper Midwest, maybe, as opposed to, kind of Boston area, New York area. But, I think there are so many commonalities with, there are so many common elements that the Midwest shares with other places. And I think if you're writing about kind of New York, you can write that Manhattan novel, but that's only going to resonate with a very few people, right? Whereas I think, a Midwestern book is going to resonate with every transplant that's come from the Midwest to every other place in the country. It's going to resonate with, Southerners and people in Texas, and because we are, there's this idea that the coasts are sort of cosmopolitan, and I think there is a certain element that's true, but I think most of us are just regular people, and we live where we live, and we love our family, and we try to, do the right thing. We go to our jobs, we go to church, we do all of that stuff. And I think there's a lot of room for that in writing, and I think a lot of people are trying to reach for something that's, I guess if you're Robert Crace, who's an LA guy through and through, right? If you're Greg Hurwitz, those LA books are perfectly made things in their way. And I read them because I get to be a tourist in LA. But if I want to see somebody who's writing about a place I know, right? I read Kent Kruger, sorry, it's William Kent Kruger is his what he writes under, and his Cork O'Connor books set in northern Minnesota. I read Laurie Rader Day and her books set in Chicago and Indiana. You know, I like to read about people like me, and I like to read about stuff that feels like it could be me.
Sure. And I also feel like if you travel around, you can wear a Milwaukee Brewers hat in Phoenix, and people say, "Oh, is that restaurant still open?" You know, everyone, you go down south, they're all from here.
Yeah.
You go to Phoenix, they're all from here. And I think that's great. And I think that does add an element that makes these books kind of a little more, universal, to coin a phrase,
Well, that's the goal, right? Is to find as many readers as you can, and not to talk down or pander to people. I'm writing what I think are fairly complex characters and complex stories. I'm not reaching for the lowest common denominator, but I am trying to talk to, sort of something universal. So.
That's great. I see you dedicated The Runaway to your mother. And did your parents encourage you to write a lot as a child? And were you a good student?
Was I a good student? My mother definitely encouraged me to write. My dad was sort of like, "That's great, but you do need to support yourself," which is kind of his role in the world, every father's role in the world. It was my mom's idea that I join the Shorewood High School newspaper as a freshman, and I ended up as the editor-in-chief, and writing an 8-part soap opera in which I got to make fun of include my friends and make fun of my enemies, and she certainly was more supportive of sort of that dream, and I was the youngest kid, so it's easier for the younger kid to sort of take a random path, I think, than the oldest, who is sort of the torchbearer. I was not a great student in high school. I spent a lot more time on the newspaper and drama club and that kind of stuff. But I loved going to college. I like the learning part. I'm not that interested in the grades part. But I loved essentially, taking an idea and running with it and turning the assignments upside down. The TAs would hate me, but the professors would love me, because I would go to the professors' office hours and say, "Hey, those topics aren't very interesting for the term paper, but can I write this?" And their professors are always happy to have you engage in some way. So I loved going to school, and I have fantasies about going back. I have no idea what I would learn, but I just love the environment. I love the sort of the idea of diving deep into something new.
Right. Because a lot of students who you would say aren't good students in a classical sense are daydreaming. You're making up stories. You're scribbling poetry, and you're thinking, but you may not just be on topic, but sometimes grades, like you say, are don't tell the whole story.
I've never been very good at doing what I'm told, I have to say. I've been self-employed my whole adult life, mostly because I've had some bad bosses in my early days, and I just decided I didn't want to deal with somebody else's crap, and I wanted to reap the rewards of hard work. And so unfortunately, that's often why people start businesses, is because they don't like being told what to do.
I was a journalist in another life,
Yeah.
and I became a librarian because I love books, and I love reading, and I love writing, but I did not want to write for a newspaper anymore. So I understand. And there's a lot less rules writing fiction than there are when you're writing for a newspaper. So Helene mentions that she could no longer go to the library a few times in The Runaway in the beginning. And so it must have been very important to her. What aspect of her life, because she seems kind of so desperate to get out. Do you think the library was opening a world
Oh,
somewhere else
absolutely.
for her?
Eh,
Because she must have drove a long ways to get to that library. So it must have been very important to her.
Well, I think like a lot of people who don't have much but are hungry for the world, the library is an amazing opportunity. And if you are trying to find your way forward and to make your life better, there's no better place to start than the library. You've got public access to the internet. You've got all of the books that are in the library plus the request system. You can get anything in the system. I'm a big library fan, and actually, there's another character, Lewis. Part of Lewis's story, um, he often quotes this Malcolm X line, which is the most dangerous man in the world is a black man with a library card, and that was Lewis's path out of his really rough childhood, was to engage with the library. So I guess that's a theme that runs through my work, and I honestly I feel the same way. I write in the library some days. I have a vivid memories of going with my mom when I was a little kid, because I was a huge reader as a little kid. I read early, and it's at a certain point the librarian basically having to override the limits on what I was allowed to check out because I wanted so many books. So I have a very soft spot for the library and librarians as well in general.
That's great. Do you think that what kind of books would you picture Helene reading?
Well, I had a couple of in an earlier draft. I had the books that she had chosen, right? So she had a couple of mysteries,
Oh, that's
and she
interesting.
and she was reading what her mom was reading because they are an escape, as one of our viewers said about the library, that the library books are also an escape, but in your mind. So I think for her it was as much the internet as anything else, because how else are you going to find your way in the modern world? How are you going to find your way out of this benighted place without a phone, without any internet connection?
Mhm.
So I think she was scheming for her escape, and that's why Bogalusa basically shut it down, because he wanted her to stay exactly where she was, powerless and trapped.
Oh, okay, because when I read those couple lines, I thought maybe she's going to like her library to get travel books about, like, God, I want to escape to New Orleans, or I want to escape to, because there's a travel book for every big city. And I actually pictured her looking for something like that to read about other places and how exciting they could be. So it's interesting that you say that. That's what makes books great, because the reader can, conjure up whatever they want in their mind, and it's really not wrong, so.
Well, no, that's that writers talk about this as a two-part transaction, right? The writer provides something that's on the page, and then there's this sort of telepathic connection that's made with every reader, because they read these symbols on the page and it becomes something else in their mind, and they supply the detail, they supply their life experience, and that's what makes a book on the page into such a rich experience in your mind.
Yeah, that's great. Um, I love the analogy, and toward the beginning of the book, there's like a little bird that's trying to escape from Helene's trailer. I'm picturing this little forlorn little trailer, that probably hasn't moved in 40 years and up on blocks or something. And the little bird eventually broke its own neck and was trying to escape so badly. And I just thought, wow, it's a great comparison for this woman trying to get out of this situation. And, it just symbolized to me like Helene's sense of like futility, like this frantic bird just bopping into walls. And, was that your intention for that?
Oh,
Or am I just
absolutely. No,
reading it my own way?
that's absolutely what I wanted to do. And actually, I kept thinking about cutting that because I thought it would slow things down, kind of slow the story itself down. But I just liked it too much to take it out, which happens a lot with me. But what I wanted was to give the reader a feeling of her desperation, right? This bird, flying frantically around this trailer, unable to find the door. So it flies in through the open screen door, and bashing against the walls and the windows trying to get out. And that was sort of who Helene was in that moment. So that's exactly what I was trying to do.
Oh, that's great. Because when I read that, I'm a visual reader, and when I was reading that, I could just picture, and I could picture her watching it with with the jaw open and like, God, how can I help this poor creature get what it wants? I thought it was very good writing at that time. I really liked that part.
Thank you.
I also liked how Helene's mother, they keep using these repetitive sayings like, fortune favors the bold, and what's the other one I have here? We can do hard things, and it keeps Helene's like, kind of like with the bird thing, it kind of like, you got to look to the future, you always got to have that hope for the future. You touched on that in your acknowledgments at the end of the book a little bit, but could you talk about, that kind of, I think those sayings that she took from her mother, for me as the reader, I thought like throughout the whole book, it keeps, as bleak as stuff looks, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, there's hope here somewhere. And that's the way I got out of those sayings.
Well, that was really what I was trying to do, right? So there's one side of this story, right, which is, it's a story of sex, obsession, and murder, right? But it's also a story of strength and resilience in the face of extreme hardship. And I wanted those two to balance each other and to play off each other. And otherwise, it just becomes a very bleak story. And that's not something I want to write. And I think maybe not everybody wants to read.
There's plenty of that.
Yeah, I do think that, especially, the world is in tough shape, and I think hope at a certain point becomes kind of a radical act. I think it's easy to have things be bleak and hopeless, whether you're looking at the environment or the political situation, or a day like today in Milwaukee, just the weather. And to me, I think having some hope in there and showing a way through hard things is really part of what I'm trying to do as a writer, because that's what I'm trying to do as a person, right? Is to find my way through this challenging world. And I think that's what readers are all doing at the same time. So
as I read those hopeful little statements, as I read, I'm like, okay, what is the next chapter going to have? Like a good thing happen? What is it going to? I know it's going to happen, and you got to keep going until you know it's going to happen. Something good's going to happen. And sometimes what the good might not appear to be so good at that time, like in life. Sometimes things that are really a positive thing may not actually look like it at the time. That's why retrospect is 2020. But I think like with her, and there's some other foreshadowing in the book too. Like there's a part where when Helene meets a couple people and they keep saying, oh, this is going to end badly, and it's kind of like it's the exact opposite of what Helene was thinking all the time. And I find that juxtaposition kind of interesting. Was Roy, Frank, was it Frank his name? I think it was. He was Roy's partner. He says, oh, this isn't going to end well. And I thought, well, Helene's just thinking, I want to get out of here. And I like that juxtaposition. In fact, what is it? I think I have it here. It says, when Roy first meets Helene and offers to give Helene a ride, it said, this is a bad idea, Roy. And it's like, because you don't know why, but you want to find out. And I like those aspects in there, because it's just foreshadowing to you're going to have clarity later. And that makes me want to read.
Well, that's the goal. The funny thing is that I talk to readers and writers who say, now, how do you do that? Do you sort of diagram do you diagram it out? Do you plan ahead? And I'm not that smart. I had no idea how things were going to move forward. I just knew that I wanted to balance Helene's optimism with the knowledge that, things were going to go worse, right? I wanted the reader to have some hint that things were not going to proceed, evenly forward, because that's what we read for, right? We read for these ups and downs.
Mm-hmm. So that means you don't know how book's going to end,
No.
which is interesting because, I mean, everyone has different writing styles, but a lot of like, even like if you're going to write a film or a screenplay, you have an ending and then you work your way back a lot of times, and you fill in the blanks to the big conclusion. And I find that you don't know how it's going to end. So you could possibly have 3 or 4 different endings, then you just pick the right one.
Well,
Does
sure.
that-
This book, there's a last section, and it ends in a certain way with a certain tone, and I wrote that in 3 or 4 different ways, 3 or 4 different times, and I didn't really know I would write it, and I would say that's not quite how I want it to go. I would write it again, and it would be different, and it was just still not quite how I wanted it to be. I didn't know there's a climax scene before that, and I didn't know how that was going to end either.
Mhm.
And that's, there are in the writing world, people are either known as plotters, people who outline or write beat notes or somehow plan ahead what they're doing.
Right.
And then there are people like me who write by the seat of our pants, and we're called pantsers. And I begin at the beginning, and I just write forward, and I don't really know what's going to happen. And it's kind of a nerve-wracking way to work. It's it's sort of like performance art in a way. It's not relaxing. I don't know always what's going to happen next. My wife can, I'm sure, hear me across the hall gnashing my teeth in my office as I try to figure it out. But that's the way that works for me. I've tried to be more organized, and it just comes out, flat. It comes out like there's just no life to it. There's a lot of conversation in MFA programs and writing classes about finding your voice, right? Finding the
Right. I've heard that repeatedly.
Oh yes, and it's for me, I think what's important, and certainly finding your voice is important, but you also have to find your process. You have to find what works for you.
Mhm.
And for some people, it's going to be writing a 5-page outline. For some people, it's going to be writing a 50-page outline that just morphs and gets bigger and bigger until it's a novel. For me, it's finding the point of entry that works. And once I've got it, I'm off. So we actually had a question there. Hang on, there was one in the chat.
I was going to say, let's see, so many of the main characters just know Helene is going to be trouble. So why are we rooting for her? That was my question, really. But I had a lot of stuff in there about, how there's all these parts leading throughout the beginning of the book about, oh, she's going to be trouble. She's going to be trouble. You just know she's going to be trouble. So like, why do I want her to win if she's going to be all this trouble? But you do. And I think it's good writing to create that, because I want her to win. And I don't really know why, but I do. And I think that's just good writing. It must be plotting or some aspect of it that makes me want to see what happens next.
Well, it's character, right? It's if you care about who that character is, if they seem real to you, then it is just how we are wired. Unless we're sociopaths, that we want to, if we can identify with them, if they feel real to us, we want things to go well for them. We begin to root for them.
Mm-hmm.
And
I was rooting for her.
That's
and I wasn't I wasn't really sure why, but yeah, I wanted it to all work out. And when you were talking about earlier, I had a thought about, and you seem to be really good at this. Your books don't have, I'm such a reader where there's a lot of books where there's like characters, and I wonder why they're in there. Because they show up, they serve a small purpose and just that purpose, and then they're gone. But your books, you have just enough characters introduced they serve a role for sure in the story, but you don't have extraneous characters around. So like, how do you decide that Roy's going to have this many cohorts? Or, is it just you pick 3 guys, or is it like, how much is too much, and how do you decide how much is too little, or is it just feeling?
Well, I really do feel my way forward a lot, although I do think I read somewhere, there's a guy named Donald Moss, who's a literary agent who wrote a great book. Do I still have it around here? It's probably in a box in my basement, unfortunately. It's called Writing the Breakout Novel. And he has a list of sort of rules for successful commercial fiction. And one is not too many characters. And so in the early days, I would end up combining characters to sort of reduce the number. And one of my strategies as a writer, again, in the early days, was when I was stuck, I would just introduce a new character, which is, it works,
Yeah.
but also there's a certain point at which they're not doing anything.
Right.
So I do think there's a point at which I count the number of characters I have, the people that have real speaking parts, right? That have real roles.
Right.
So that is part of it, as I don't want to have too many characters. But I also think about logistics, right? So if I am Roy and his crew, if I am doing what Roy is doing, and I'm not gonna spoil the surprise with it, but how many people do you need to pull that off?
Right.
Right. It can't be just two of you. So how many, this scheme that they have logistically, how does it work? Well, so I had to sort of come up in my head with a plausible way that you would do this. And it had to feel plausible, not just to me, but it had to be something I could essentially argue for with the reader. And so that's how that worked. And there's a scene where we have law enforcement officers from different jurisdictions all showing up. And I got kind of stuck because I didn't really know, in this rural location in rural South Dakota, where this scene takes place, logistically, how would law enforcement deal with this? So I got on the phone to a county sheriff, and I was like, so how, you have two officers in your sheriff's department, and you're patrolling a county that's roughly the size of Rhode Island. How do you do this? And he was generous with his time and kind enough to sort of explain what the methodology was. And then I talked to another investigator for a larger town that's closer to Chicago, and they again had a very different attitude and go about things very differently. And so I was able to sort of play those off each other in a bit in that scene. And so part of it is instinct, part of it is research, part of it is preference. And again, I am just sort of feeling my way along. And one of the problems that I have is I get stuck, and I sort of say to myself, so what's my obstacle? What isn't working? Right? Is there some information I need to learn? Did I make a wrong turn? Am I not able to sort of, does the structure as a whole not coming together? So there are so many variables and so many, it really is, it's like juggling 1,000 balls at once.
So I think you really do a good job, because as I'm reading it, as a librarian, I'm like, oh, I want to look that up, and I do look up stuff. And I'm sure you had to do some research on how to be a good, I don't want to give anything away, but there's got to be research involved in writing these books. And to what extent of that, I don't know, but I do find your books believable. And I dislike a lot of fiction when, like I said, there's too many characters that are just there to obviously serve a plot point, and then they're gone. And it drives me nuts. And you don't do that. So, good writing. I appreciate that.
Well, to go back a bit, there's a question from Donna Neubauer that she asked, do I have to edit a lot? And does my editor influence my ending? I thought this was sort of part of that same conversation. So I'm kind of writing forward, making it up as I go along. And then one of the things that I do when I get stuck is I'll just go back to the beginning. I leave myself notes as I go. And then I go back to the beginning and I go through it again until it is the way it needs to be. And then I can go forward again until I get stuck. And then I go back and I sort of revise as I go, so that by the time I get to the end, I really only need a couple of weeks to and to go back through one last set of notes to kind of go back and to know the things I need to do and what I need to do to get it polished enough to send off. So the plus side to working the way that I do is that there's almost only one draft, as opposed to going through it multiple times. And my editor never really sees anything until it's done. And she's not, the advice I get from her is, these things don't match up, there's some choice I made that I made a different choice later on that I needed to go back and line things up. Or she says, this scene doesn't work. It needs to be faster. It needs to be slower. But she's never said, change the ending. And again, for me, the ending is kind of the whole deal. So I'm grateful she hasn't.
That actually, I have a question written down, and it's a great time to bring it up. I was going to say, how do you know when to end a book, and are you given a page restriction from the publisher? So that you just kind of answered a little bit of that in your response. But are you contracted to like write a certain amount of pages in a novel?
It's actually a word count is in my contract is 90,000 words.
Okay.
And that's sort of the average, the length of a thriller. And
Yeah.
and I know I have friends who write at 70,000 words or 80,000 words. I have a friend whose books routinely run from 150 to 165,000 words. And that just boggles my mind, how he's able to do that. So I sort of think of things in terms of acts, 3 acts, and maybe a 4th, depending on how the book goes. And so I think the first act is, somewhere around 15,000 words. The middle of it is roughly 60, and then the end is another 30. It might be 20, 50, 20. But those are sort of the proportions I'm going for. And there are some, sort of some classic structural kind of moves that need to be made, but I don't plan it that way. I don't say at 15,000 words, I need to have a big reversal, right? If you read the screenplay books, they all talk, they're at a sixth of the way and you do this, a third of the way and you do that, halfway point. I don't begin with those, but sometimes when I get stuck or when I'm sort of trying to think about what I've written already, I'll go back and I'll sort of deconstruct it a little bit. I do write an outline of something, and there's a point at which I'll go back and I'll outline what I have already, because it lets me see it a little more clearly, because as the book gets bigger, you can't hold it all in your head anymore. At least I can't. Maybe I could have when I was 25. I can't anymore now.
That's interesting, because from a journalism background, we are always told to write in inches, so I always thought like space, I got to fill this space.
Right.
So it's very interesting that you do it that way. Do you think Peter is a moral character?
Peter, he is a very moral character. He has a definite sense of right and wrong. It may not align with mainstream society's sense of right and wrong.
Right.
But that is essentially everything that drives him. And there's a reason for this, and there's a reason for Peter's why he can't step away when he sees somebody in trouble. And so Peter has post-traumatic stress from his time in the Marines, and it's gotten better as the books progress, but there's something that there's some research that says a lot of post-traumatic stress comes from something called moral failure, where you either participate in or you're witness to something that essentially goes against your internal sense of right and wrong, what society also and or what society accepts as right and wrong. And if there is any circumstance that is so filled with moral failure, it's urban warfare, which is what Peter has gone through in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's a long history of veterans coming home from war and essentially applying themselves to the social good. They become cops, they become firefighters, they become teachers. They take time off work to do disaster relief, to help out with floods or wildfires or hurricane relief. And that kind of atonement, this is one of the things that we know now really helps, that helps people recover from post-traumatic stress. And so this is kind of part of why Peter is built this way as a character.
So along, you mentioned his Marines. I was thinking that is in the book a couple times, and not just in this novel, but in prior novels, Peter has been compared. I don't remember. I think it's himself, or maybe it's the omniscient, not an omniscient narrator, but because he compares himself to a wolf, or being compared to a wolf a couple times in different novels, and in this one again. And I thought, why not a puma, or why not a tiger? And then I thought, well, a lot of times Marine Corps units, like the local unit here in Milwaukee for the Marine Reserves, they had a nickname called the Mad Ghosts, and a lot of the 23rd Marines, and a lot of Marine units were named after, various scary things or intimidating things. And I thought, maybe his wolf thing came from his time in the Marines, or was that just something you just picked an animal,
No, it's actually not a wolf, it's a werewolf.
I see werewolf too. I have that written down here. So,
but so part of that, right, is one of the things that happens, and I've seen this happen with people that I know that have served in combat, is there is a point when there is just a change in their personality. They go from being a happy-go-lucky person with a beer in their hand, and then something happens, and they look across the street and they see a car they don't like, right? Or they hear a screen door slam and it sounds like a gunshot, right? And they immediately shift into that combat mode, right? And so that's what I'm trying to do with that werewolf piece, right? Is that, and where is Peter on that cycle, right? From being a wolf to a man. So these are all these things that I'm sort of trying to play with.
Okay. Interesting.
So although I like the idea of the company logo, the company mascot sort of thing. That's an interesting thing to think about. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, that's what I really thought, because I like military history, and every unit has a certain, really cool kind of the big red one or whatever.
Right.
And I thought maybe that's what you were going for that. So cool. Where do you think Peter and the gang go from here? I was thinking about, like, I read a lot of series, and like Harlan Coben has taken like a character in his early books, this Wynn guy, and now he's got his own Wynn book. And I thought, could you do a Lewis book?
Well, that actually is what I'm working on. That Lewis often shows up to help Peter, and Lewis sort of steps into Peter's world. And the book I'm working on now, we are in Lewis's world, and Peter shows up to help Lewis in Lewis's world. So I'm still wrestling with it very, very much. But
Lewis is a Milwaukee guy,
Lewis is a Milwaukee guy, but Lewis is also a man of the world in a distinct way. So I'm curious. I really don't know where this book is going to go. I've got a certain chunk in. I feel like I've got my feet under me, but it's going to be interesting to see how I pull this off. It's always an adventure.
Oh, great. I'm sure we're all looking forward to that. Were there any questions that you saw interesting?
Oh yeah, let's see. I'm looking at the chat here. Let's see.
Is it okay if I
Oh, sure.
So I saw one that was pretty interesting. I don't know if you caught it. Vicky asks, is Peter Ash completely a creation of your imagination, or is he any part of him, or is any part of him based on someone you know?
That is a great question. Peter is not me. I'm not a veteran. I never served overseas. I've never been in combat, but he is a version of me, I guess you'd say. Maybe the version that I would like to be. I would like to be kind of a better person. I would like to have the courage of my convictions a bit more, like Peter does. It is something that series writers tend to do, is we tend to sort of try to invent the better version of ourselves. I think Spencer was that for Robert Parker. I have lots of friends who write series, and it's kind of fun to read their stuff, and this character that becomes their doppelganger. And I think some would say, oh no, not at all. But I think in order to write somebody convincingly, there has to be some of you in there. and there's definitely some of me in Peter. It's interesting. He's evolving and moving forward, and I'm kind of struggling with how much Peter should change, how much Peter should evolve from book to book. So I don't know, it's an interesting question, and I honestly I try not to look too closely at it, because the process is for me sort of like what's the joke about the ant and the millipede, and the ant says to the millipede, "Boy, that's a whole lot of feet. How do you walk when you have all that many feet?" And the millipede says, "Well, you pick up one foot, and then." Right. I think if I knew too much about it, it would be harder I'd get stuck. So I try not to think about it quite too much.
I wanted to ask, I wanted to read, if I could just give you a sign, I just wanted to read my favorite 2 sentences from.
Oh, please do. Please do.
Let's see here. These are my 2 favorite sentences, and I can really see this. Like I said, I'm a visual reader, but these are my favorites. And they're together. Behind the splayed gray wreck of a barn, they were invisible from the road. The old farmyard had long ago reverted to weedy meadow, and all around them grew dark pines and tall cedars full of birdsong. I just love the word splayed and reverted. I want to just, I can't think of a way to use those words. That's great. And I can really see it. I can picture someone like looking at a screen, but through their fingers, kind of like God, it's a great place to dump a body, But I really love those 2 sentences together. I just think that's a great visual. I don't know if you had that vision in your head or what, but I really like those 2 sentences.
Well, thank you. I think not every writer pays quite as much attention to the language as I do. I really spend a lot of time on sentences, and I choose my words carefully. And I love it when on social media somebody picks a sentence or a phrase or a paragraph that they like, and they'll tweet it to me, or they'll send it to me in on Facebook or something. I love it when somebody finds something that speaks to them, because for me it's all about sort of the craft from sentence to sentence. And that's how I build character. That's how I build action scenes. That's how I build emotional conflict. It's just the next sentence. So I love it when people do that. So thank you.
I was picturing, when you were describing that farm, I was picturing like one of those old Universal, Wolfman movies or something, with the barn and these trees, and I enjoyed that. Are there any other questions that we had from our chats or anything you want to touch on?
Yeah, Nancy Ash says, in all your books, the setting is another character. Is this intentional? Is that where you start with the story? Yeah, I'm really big on place. I'm big on setting. I want it to be vivid. I want it to be distinct also from my other books. I want every book to feel different, and the setting is one easy way to do that. A Milwaukee book is going to be very different from a rural Nebraska book, which is going to be very different from a Denver book, or a Memphis book. So that's very much intentional. And it's also, I know writers who are not super interested in the specificity of place. And again, everybody makes their own choices. But for me, setting is such an easy thing to do, to make your story feel vivid and atmospheric. You get to describe the barn, you get to describe the trees in a way that makes the place a little spookier, that makes the place a little, again, kind of whatever the scene is calling for. And in terms of, she also asks, is this where you start with the story? And sometimes it really is where I start with. The Memphis book, I sort of had picked this spot because I wanted that Memphis is the biggest city in the New Madrid fault zone, which is the biggest earthquake area. It's in the center of the U.S. It's overdue for a quake, and I wanted to write kind of a man against nature book. And so that was kind of why I picked Memphis. But kind of like in this book where Helene kind of hijacked the story, the Memphis book, there's a young street kid, I guess. He's not really a boy, he's a teenager, who named Eli Bell, who just kind of takes over. And the book becomes kind of about him and his challenges. But it wouldn't have happened without Memphis. It wouldn't have happened without that piece. So yeah, I'm a big fan of setting. I'm a big fan of place as character. See what else we got done.
Well, take a look and see. I know you wrote about Iceland.
Oh yeah, that was a lot of fun.
I would love to go there personally. I think my favorite book takes place in Colorado, just because I like the place, and I can understand where you say the setting. And I think it was your last novel before The Runaway, where you're describing Hampton Avenue. You're down at the lakefront. You're the train yards in Chicago. Everyone who's driven by there notices those train yards, and they're never ending. And I thought you described that, and it's a great setting for a place. Well, so I think you do that very well.
Well, thank you. And I guess, and I sort of haven't realized this until this book, but I kind of realized that if I think of this series as sort of a project, right, then my project is to kind of write about these different versions of America, these different views of these places, and how this enormous country that we live in, and how varied it is, just even from state to state. So that's part of the pleasure for me, is to sort of dive into this country and to tell a little piece of the story of America with every different book.
Actually, the rivers play a pretty prominent role in The Runaway. Some of the major scenes take place around a river. So it's definitely a unique setting, because it's not in Memphis. It's not in a city. There's not a lot of people around. And that adds a different element to the story.
Sure. Well, and the Plains is so atmospheric to me. It makes you feel both sort of, so small and so isolated at the same time. Especially if you're on foot. When you're in a car and you're driving on the freeway, right? If you're on the interstate, and you're driving through, South Dakota or Nebraska, it's not super exciting. You're in the world of the interstate. It's the chain motels and the chain gas stations and the chain restaurants. But once you get off the interstate and you're on foot in these places, the sky is so huge. I never spent that much time in the Plains until I got to doing the research for this book, and I just really fell in love with it. It's I don't know. It made me feel like a little speck, which is, I think, a fine thing for a person to be reminded of how small we are in the scheme of things.
There was an interesting question that I just saw in the chat. Lawrence asked, do you or have you ever watched the program Big Sky? It aired on ABC. It feels like it kind of has the same theme with some of your books. So have you ever watched this program?
I have not, although a friend of mine, CJ Box, who goes by Chuck, it's based on his standalone books. Chuck is, I'll call him CJ Box because that's what everybody would actually know him as. He's a wonderful writer, and he writes about the outdoors, and he writes about working people in a lot of the same ways that I do. So I've not seen that program, but I'm a big fan of his books.
Too. I think I've read every one of the CJ Box books.
Oh, he's fantastic. I've got Dark Sky, which was his previous latest, queued up, and we have the same publisher, so they're actually going to send me his new one. We're on a panel together. There's a great book festival called the Tucson Festival of Books that we're on a panel together, so we get to talk about writing the outdoors, which is going to be a bunch of fun. He's a super smart and a super interesting guy.
Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, and we'll wrap it up for the night. And there's probably not an answer for this, but Kind of like being a parent, do you have a favorite novel, or do you have a favorite book that you've written or otherwise?
You know, what I find is that I like certain things about certain novels. I don't have a favorite novel, but there are characters that I am more fond of than others. Like Helene, for example. You know, I have characters that I think, like Helene will have another book at some point, just because
I'd like to
she's
read
such a strong character, and she's got such a strong voice. And I would love to kind of see what the next chapter of her story is. You know, there are scenes I love. There's my second novel, Burning Bright. There's a scene that's up in the tops of the redwoods, where I have no idea where that came from. I could not conjure that on purpose if I wanted to. You know, it's one of these things that just sort of appeared out of the ether, right? If there is the muse whispering in my ear, that's how that showed up. So, you know, there's something that I love about every book. But there's also, I think one of the realities for a writer is that, you know, I'm never as successful as I want to be with each book. I begin with this premise and this idea, and you know, the minute I start writing the first sentences, immediately, you know, the translation from my head to the page is imperfect. And it's just the nature of the beast. So it's an interesting process. But you know, this is my 7th book. I never thought my first would get published. I wrote 3 books I couldn't get published before that first book, and so like I've got them lined up on my bookshelf here. And you know, when I'm feeling discouraged, I can just go over and I can just say, hey, I've done this 7 times before. Just keep at it. And they all seemed hopeless and terrible at multiple points in their writing. And so when I'm having a stuck day or a stuck week sometimes, you know, it's a good reminder that there's something I like in every one of these books.
Well, I've liked them too. With that, I think we fulfilled our hour, and it's time to wrap it up. But I want to encourage everybody, if you have not already, pick up a copy of The Runaway by Nick Petrie. And if you can do so, get a copy at Boswell Books. And I'd also like to recommend everyone look at mpl.org, the Milwaukee Public Library's website. We have a lot of events. We have other author visits. We have something for everybody. So just take a look at the Milwaukee Public Library's webpage. And I'd also like everyone to continue to patronage Boswell Books, because they are a great partner for the library. And I want to thank Nick for joining us today, and we're looking forward to your next novel. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Dan. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody for taking time out of your what day is today? Wednesday. Taking time out of your Wednesday night. I lose track of the days. And I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. You have a great evening.
Thank you.